Welcome to The Explainer. Okay, today we are diving into an absolutely unbelievable geopolitical paradox that's unfolding right now in the Middle East. It's this wild situation where one side is comprehensively winning the military battle up in the skies, but at the exact same time, they're losing a devastating war over the global economy. We're going to break down the whole US-Israel-Iran conflict and analyze how a presumed easy air campaign just crashed headfirst into geographical reality. It's creating what the International Energy Agency is already calling the largest oil supply shock on record. So buckle up, because the stakes here literally affect everything from global military readiness to the actual price you're going to pay at the grocery store.
Here's our roadmap for today's Explainer. First, a tale of two wars. Then, weaponizing the Strait of Hormuz. Next, the global economic shock, followed by a costly war of attrition. And finally, we'll look at why there are no good options left.
All right, let's dive into Section 1, a tale of two wars, conventional supremacy versus asymmetric strategy. To really wrap our heads around this crisis, we have to recognize we're not just looking at one unified conflict. We're actually looking at two totally separate, parallel wars happening at the exact same time, and both of them incredibly lopsided.
So, in conventional military terms, the aerial war is basically no contest. The US and Israel are enjoying complete, undeniable aerial supremacy. They've obliterated the majority of Iran's air defenses, eliminated swaths of senior leadership, and honestly, sunk the vast majority of Iran's surface fleet. By every traditional metric we have, they are absolutely winning this war. But the economic war? That's a completely different story. The Iranian regime knew right from the start they couldn't win a conventional technological battle. So they just shifted their entire focus to shutting down the critical Strait of Hormuz. By doing that, they've effectively blocked 1/5 of the entire global supply of oil and liquefied natural gas. All those massive conventional military victories simply haven't neutralized that immense economic leverage.
Which brings us to Section 2, weaponizing the Strait of Hormuz, geography over technology. Let's look at how this builds into Iran's actual game plan. Because, as you're about to see, all the technological supremacy in the world simply cannot alter physical geography.
54 kilometers. Think about that for a second. That is the narrowest width of the Strait of Hormuz. It's flanked on both sides by this really rough, imposing mountainous terrain. And the actual sea lanes that these massive, towering tanker ships have to transit across, they're right in the center, and they are so incredibly narrow that there's literally only space for two of them at a time, one going in each direction. It is a massive, incredibly vulnerable geographical choke point.
And this setup brilliantly illustrates why Iran's strategy is so incredibly potent. You see, to control this 54-kilometer gap, Iran doesn't actually need a massive, fully functioning navy to physically barricade the water. As our sources point out, all they really need to do is create an atmosphere of uncertainty, risk, and fear. And they do exactly that by using an estimated stockpile of around 50,000 cheap drones, like the Shahed 136, which can fly for 1,500 kilometers, along with a bunch of sea mines. Just by occasionally attacking merchant ships, they create an environment where commercial vessels simply refuse to make the trip, or insurance companies flat out refuse to cover them. It's essentially a de facto closure, enforced entirely by geography and cheap asymmetric weapons.
So, what exactly happens when 1/5 of the global energy supply gets cut off? Let's get into Section 3, the global economic shock, from blockade to recession. Let's connect this distant geographical choke point right back to your wallet.
The de facto closure of Hormuz has triggered an absolutely massive oil supply shock. Remember before this conflict, when oil hovered around $60 a barrel? Well, since the blockade began, it's spiked to roughly $100 a barrel. That is a 40% jump. Economists are warning that this $100 level alone could push US and European inflation right back up over 4%. But here's the truly alarming part. If this blockade holds and oil hits $140 a barrel, global inflation rates could easily climb to 5 or even 6%. A recent Oxford economics study suggests that if oil hits that $140 mark and the closure lasts through the spring, the global economy could very well tip over into a mild recession. The domino effect here is absolutely brutal.
And unfortunately, there's just no quick fix here. Let's say combat stopped completely tomorrow. The timeline to normalcy is still agonizing. First, you have to repair all the damaged facilities. Just fixing Qatar's massive LNG site, which alone handles nearly 1/5 of the global supply, is going to take 3 to 5 years. Then you've got to restart all the mothballed oil and gas production across the Gulf states. After that, you have to reposition the global tanker fleets that totally fled to other markets. And finally, restart the Asian refineries. We're looking at months just for the market to achieve any sort of stabilization, and literally years to fully repair the deepest infrastructure wounds.
Now, what's really interesting about this next part is how the costs are stacking up. Section 4, a costly war of attrition, the military strain. We are watching what was meant to be a super swift air campaign totally devolve into a grueling, unbelievably expensive slog.
Just take a look at the U.S. military strain from the first 16 days alone. In that short time, the U.S. military used over 11,000 munitions. That's more than any Western campaign since the 2003 invasion of Iraq. They fired over 850 Tomahawk cruise missiles. And at nearly $4 million a pop, we are talking about over $3.4 billion burned through in a matter of weeks. That's potentially a quarter of America's entire pre-war stockpile. THAAD interceptor inventories, they're now critically low, and replacements take years to arrive. And let's not forget the human toll, which is just as steep. The USS Gerald R. Ford aircraft carrier has been deployed for over 280 days. That surpasses Vietnam War records and is causing severe crew fatigue. This is the stark, everyday reality of fighting 50,000 incredibly cheap Iranian drones with a limited supply of multi-million-dollar precision weapons.
And paradoxically, all this immense military pressure hasn't fractured the Iranian government like you might expect. According to our sources, the violent elimination of the aging supreme leader via missile strike actually forced a transition under extreme pressure. The regime rapidly coalesced behind his son, Mojtaba Khamenei. Having lost his father, mother, wife, and son in these strikes, this new leader, who's already known to be closely tied to the hardline IRGC, is in absolutely no mood to negotiate. So effectively, this massive air campaign has just hardened the regime's stance even further.
Which leaves the current U.S. administration trapped in an astonishingly difficult spot. Section 5, no good options left, the administration's dilemma. Let's take a totally impartial look at the board right now, because frankly, the choices are pretty bleak.
There are really only 3 paths forward from here. Choice 1, negotiate while Iran still holds all the leverage over the strait, which basically means accepting some highly unfavorable terms. Choice 2, do nothing, and watch the global economy slide right into a recession, which obviously carries immense political blowback. Or choice 3, try to double down and launch a massive, escalatory ground campaign to physically force the strait open. But here's the catch. Geography makes that nearly impossible. Iran is shielded by these towering mountain ranges. If we look at the troop ratios used in the 2003 Iraq War, invading a country of Iran's size and population would require an estimated 1 million soldiers just for the invasion, and over 500,000 to occupy it. You'd be looking at a Vietnam-level commitment that would very likely require bringing back the military draft.
So you might be wondering, what about limited military actions? Seizing Karg Island is an option that's heavily discussed. The goal seems obvious, right? Deny the regime its funding by seizing the island that handles 90% of Iran's crude oil exports. But the risk is immense. Taking all that oil completely off the global market would only exacerbate the massive supply shock we just talked about, spiking prices even higher. And crucially, Karg Island is hundreds of kilometers away from the Strait of Hormuz. Seizing it does absolutely nothing to stop Iran from firing its stockpiles of kamikaze drones from deep within its own interior directly into the strait. The core blockade just remains totally untouched.
Now, some people might ask, well, why not just escort the commercial ships? Okay, an escort mission through a 54-kilometer choke point is an incredibly resource-intensive nightmare. Because the strait is so narrow, every 2 commercial tankers would likely require their own dedicated destroyer, plus continuous air cover and airborne warning aircraft just to fend off incoming drones. The U.S. only has about 8 destroyers currently available in that entire theater, so it would be an infinitely expensive, totally open-ended gauntlet. You'd just be burning through scarce interceptors with absolutely no clear end in sight.
Which brings us to our final overarching question. As what was originally intended to be a rapid, presumed easy air campaign devolves into a grueling, years-long war of attrition akin to the conflict in Ukraine, how will the global economy endure the true cost of the Strait of Hormuz? We have a situation where bombs cannot alter physical geography, and overwhelming technological dominance cannot undo an asymmetric economic blockade. The Hormuz paradox really shows us that in the modern world, winning the battle doesn't always mean you win the war. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep analyzing, and I'll see you in the next one.